In the vast and exciting world of Red Dead Redemption 2, players are immersed in an environment where almost anything is possible. The endless choices to make in the game allow players to create their own unique journey. Oftentimes, players will remain on a straight and narrow path to ensure a playthrough that they felt satisfied with. It's clear to see why players choose a safer and tighter path when playing the game, but what if you decided one day to play loosely and carefree, almost as if there were no consequences for your actions? I was curious myself to see what happens when the game is played loosely, carefree, and without any regard to your morals. So I took it upon myself to try out some insane activities that most players would stray far from. Join me in this video as I embark on an interesting journey in testing some of the craziest things capable in Red Dead Redemption 2. The first item on my list was to shoot up an entire town. Now, I know this sounds crazy, but remember, I have no morals in this video. The first step in this process was to make a decision on which weapons to use for this encounter. I felt that only the best would suffice, so I chose 4 of my top favorite weapons: the Lancaster repeater, the semi-auto shotgun, the semi-automatic pistol, and the sawed-off shotgun. I assumed that this scenario would play out perfectly and without difficulty, but I was dead wrong. As soon as I began shooting, everyone within the town began to run away from me, which wasn't an issue for me. A few town folk decided to fire back at me, but I ultimately overcame their advances. My one major issue was the law. I assumed that they would be easy to take out. However, the brute force that these lawmen packed was more than what I could handle. In the first attempt, I was taken out within seconds. The second attempt, within a few more seconds. The third attempt, I was able to last slightly longer because of my swift maneuvers, but in the end, they were able to get the best of me. On my fourth and final attempt, I decided to locate a room in the hotel. This room would be my stronghold, and I would remain there for as long as was necessary. It turns out that no matter how many officers you take out, more and more and more will always show up. I didn't even know where these guys were coming from. All I knew was that they were pretty dumb. They took no note of the pile of dead bodies built up in front of the door, and one after the other they came slowly strolling by, hoping to become a hero. After several minutes of this mind-numbing task, I became annoyed with the endless officers and allowed them to overpower me and end the unwinnable conflict. After committing the heinous crime of shooting up a town and taking out a large amount of people, I felt somewhat guilty for my behavior. One solution to rid myself from the face of the earth was to get run over by a train. Before ending myself on the train tracks, I was curious to see what it would look like if someone else were to get ran over by the train. Obviously, no person would be willing to partake in this experiment, so I had to locate someone and take them by force. This man was certainly not happy with me, but I needed him to understand that this sacrifice was in the name of science. After placing him on the track precisely how I wanted, I stood over by a large rock and waited for the train. After a few minutes of waiting, I could hear the whistle of the train and see the smoke rising from the distance as it was approaching. To my surprise, it was at this exact moment that my participant broke free from his restraints. With very little time to spare, I rapidly lassoed him, tied him again, and tried to run away, but I was not fast enough, and the train made quick work with me. Although this was the original goal, I still felt the need to experience what happens when a train hits an NPC. If you've ever played the first Red Dead Redemption, then you remember how the train would obliterate anything in its path, ultimately causing whatever it hit to explode. I had to see if this was the case with this game as well. After locating another participant and taking care of a couple loose ends, I had everything ready to go, and this time when the train arrived, I was ready. I placed the participant down and waited to see the outcome. There was no explosion and no obliterating, but once the train passed, all that was left behind was a single leg. Surely the train must have dragged my participant down a ways, and sure enough, there he was, just a few meters from his initial starting point, and with one leg missing. For his courageous sacrifice in the advancement of science, I felt it was only right to give him a proper burial. Now to test for myself. I died as soon as the train touched me. Next on my list, I thought it would be interesting to locate the highest point in RDR2 and jump off. To me, this seemed like an easy task to accomplish. I was expecting zero difficulties with this scenario, however, I quickly learned that this game does not make anything out of the ordinary easy to accomplish. After some research, I was able to locate where the highest point in the game was, and it happened to be located in Mount Hagen. After some major struggling to locate the highest point accessible, I realized that there would be no way to jump off, considering the highest point was at the top of a slope. As disappointed as I was, I couldn't let it stop me from achieving my goal to die from the hands of gravity. So I located another mountaintop to jump from. It seemed promising at first, but unfortunately the drop was not far enough to take me out, or even be interesting for that matter. So instead of locating the highest point in the game, I opted out for the highest cliff or vertical drop in the game. After some research, I was directed to Manteca Falls. As I began to travel toward that point on the map, I was stopped by bounty hunters who ended my journey. On my second attempt, I again was unable to succeed in reaching that point of the map. The bounty hunters had my scent, and it seemed as if they always knew where I was at. After the fifth attempt, I became very annoyed and decided to switch over to John Marston instead, considering he was not wanted, dead or alive, like Arthur Morgan was. After the painful and rather irritating attempt to pass through the lower left side of the map, I was finally able to locate the famous waterfall I had been searching for. Unfortunately, it was rather underwhelming and very disappointing. It was not as high up as I was hoping, and so the fall was very anticlimactic. After the painful and irritating journey to jump from the highest point, I decided to attempt something that no one would dare attempt unless they were crazy. I was going to confront a grizzly bear face to face. Now obviously this is asking for a death sentence, but I felt the experience would certainly be worthwhile, and for once it certainly was. Bears are not scattered throughout the game, but instead located in a very specific spot on the map. I made my way to Grizzly's West and began the search for the fiercest creature alive. It did not take me long to locate the big fella, and with his powerful sense of smell, he was able to locate me as well. As my adrenaline began to rise, I stood my ground in order to accomplish what I came here for. I waited for the beast to strike me down, but instead he became frightened by my intense masculinity and lack of concern, and he ran away. Eventually, he was able to outrun me and disappear from my view. I decided to let him go, and I began to locate a new potential friend. Locating a second bear was almost as easy as locating the first. I once again stood my ground in hopes that this bear would also become frightened by my intense cowboy manliness. However, this bear was not fooled and knew right away that I was just a weak meat sack. He took me out with no hesitation. Another interesting scenario I wanted to place myself into was what it would be like to shoot up a campsite, and not just any campsite, Dutch's campsite. This idea, to me, was unique and exciting, and I couldn't wait to experience the consequences of this action. I eventually learned that shooting up the campsite is not something the game allows, and to no surprise either. I honestly should have realized that this wouldn't be a viable option to begin with. Ultimately, out of frustration, with my inability to commit harm to my friends, I decided to locate a different campsite. This campsite only contained 2 individuals, but they were very friendly, and I am sure eventually we could have formed a tight bond. This secondary option worked almost just as well. The only downside is that I wasn't able to kill that good-for-nothing Micah. My next goal was to see how far out this game would allow me to swim. I was determined to swim as far out as I possibly could, just to see if something interesting would happen. I traveled to the docks on the edge of Saint Denis and began my depart by jumping directly off of a boat. To my surprise, I discovered that John Marston cannot swim, not even a little bit. As soon as he touches water, he begins to lose stamina, then freaks out, and then dies. I couldn't remember if this was mentioned previously in the game. However, I wasn't going to let John's lack of athleticism ruin my goal. I quickly loaded an earlier save that had Arthur Morgan as the playable character and made my way to Saint Denis once more. Just as the first time around, I went to the docks, located a ship, and jumped off the front and directly into the water. Arthur certainly had better swimming skills than John, but it sadly wasn't by much. His ability to swim was basically just as sad as John's ability to swim. Neither of them could float or keep their head above the water. Eventually, stamina ran out once more and Arthur perished. At this point, I have experienced many difficulties in my attempts to carry out crazy events. It felt as if every time I tried to accomplish one of the tasks in this video, I would run into some sort of issue. Out of frustration with the fact that I had another failed attempt, I decided to swim with the gators instead. Although we ran into many issues during this video, I actually did learn quite a bit. I discovered the highest point in the map and found that bounty hunters near Blackwater are equivalent to a highly trained military force. I learned that there is an endless supply of officers who are both disposable and lacking in brain cells. I also learned that trains could kill you even with the slightest touch. I learned that shooting your friends is not allowed, but a couple of rednecks in the hills will do just fine. Along with this, I learned that sometimes bears are more afraid of you than you are of it. And also, last but not least, I learned that cowboys cannot swim. Now that I have done these activities for you, you don't have to wonder what it would be like to try them. I can truly say I saved you all from an irritating and painful yet interesting experience. If you have attempted any of these scenarios, leave in the comment section what your experience was like. If you haven't yet, feel free to hit that like and subscribe button. It's a great way to help me and this channel out, and I greatly appreciate it. Thanks again for watching this video, and have a great gaming experience.